It's a new year and you've decided to finally sit down and try and make the game you've always had in your head. But how do you actually go about it? In this video, I want to go over 3 different things to have in mind as you start your game design journey in 2025. Hi everyone, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a board game designer based in Newcastle, Australia. I've been designing games for about 15 years and to date I've got about 60 games published all over the world. And on this channel I want to share all the things I've learned about game design to help you be the best game designer you can be. My first point is get it on the table. By far, I think the hardest thing with making a game is going from the point where it lives in your head to where it lives on the table. That is, a physical version which you can play yourself or with friends. It's only once it actually exists and you can play it that you can actually see whether it works or not. And when you are just starting out in game design, often you'll spend a lot of time thinking and theorizing about how your game might work before you ever actually make it. And if you want to go further in game design, you need to make that leap from your head onto the table. You hear a lot of people talk about this idea of a minimal viable prototype or product. And that can be the same in game design, to make something, a prototype, which is just enough to play. It doesn't even have to be the whole game. Maybe you can only play it for 5 minutes. But the moment that you're able to actually interact with some physical components, think about the kind of decisions you're making or what the game is asking you to do, that's when you start to get some really interesting insights as to whether the game actually works or not, let alone whether it's any good. The longer it stays in your head, the longer it will be until the game is ever finished or ever exists. A game can't exist until it's actually made and on the table. And speaking of which, there are some tips for that. One is, I would say, to spend as little money as possible on making a prototype, and the cheapest way to do that is just to take a few sheets of paper and write on them. If you need to make some cards, cut up some paper and write on them. Use components that you've scavenged from other games you have or copies of Monopoly that you've found at a charity shop. By focusing on spending as little money as possible, it stops you sinking time into things which don't necessarily help you actually get your game onto the table. Also, when I say get it on the table, it doesn't mean necessarily that you have to play it with other people. It can be a really hard thing when you're making a game for the first time and you haven't had a lot of experience making games. It can be very confronting to put that game in front of other people, and that can be another block for you. But you can remove that by simply just playing it with yourself. You'll get a lot of insight just by trying the game yourself on the table. So it doesn't mean that you have to play it with other people. Of course, that's going to be useful later on in the process, but you can just focus on making it so that you can play it and enjoy it at the start. Another tip about trying to get something on the table is not trying to make the whole game at the start. Especially if you're trying to make a more complex game with maybe lots of components or characters or cards, it can be really daunting to design all of that at the start, especially when you don't quite know how everything's going to work. So don't worry about it. Instead of making a deck of 50 cards, make a deck of 20 and just play with that. Or just double up those 20 cards and then you have a deck of 40. It probably doesn't make a difference if they're all different or not. The other thing about getting the game onto the table and playing with other people is that that's the moment you start to get some feedback. It actually gives you a bit of motivation to keep going. It can be really hard when you're stuck in your own head, trying to work out if your game is any good or not. But it's in that moment where you share it with someone else, it can be that great kind of spur to keep you going. And going on to the next iteration and the next one. And that's how you finish a game. Point 2. Take the advice you need and ignore the rest. Now, this idea isn't unique to game design. In many different creative fields or any pursuit, there's so much information out there now on the internet telling you how to do something, what's the best hack to do something, how to save time, what's the best program to use. And it's the same in game design. There are a lot of different articles, a lot of different podcasts, really fantastic source of information. And in some ways, that's a great thing about starting games now, is you have such a wealth of information to draw on. But that being said, it can be quite overwhelming, and especially if the information is contradictory. How do you work out which bits to follow? Should I make a game as quickly as possible? Should I think about it a long time? Should I make something that's as graphically pleasing as possible so people can play it? Or should I just make something messy? All these questions can be hard to answer when you're starting out. I think the thing to remember is, pretty much with all advice, but definitely in game design, all these things, they're just guidelines. They're just things that are useful for people. They're not rules. You don't have to follow them slavishly. You can cherry pick which bits of advice seem to work with you. You can try something out, and if it resonates with you, then great. But if it doesn't, then discard it. Don't get trapped by thinking that there's one way to make games. There isn't. Even this channel will, where I'm saying different ideas and concepts how to make games, doesn't mean that it's the only way to make a game. I just talked about trying to get a game out of your head as quickly as possible. Doesn't mean it's the only way to make a game. Some people are able to visualize things in their head, and that's actually a really good way for them to work. So really look for things that resonate for you, but don't feel like you have to take on the rules wholesale. The other thing about that is if you follow the rules that other people make how to make games, you're going to make the games that they make. You're going to make the style of games that they make, not necessarily the games that you want to make or that you even you could make. All of us have a unique perspective on the world, a different way of thinking, and we bring that into our games, into our game design. And that's the amazing thing about the world of games and why we have such a vibrant, diverse set of different games and ways of playing. If we all followed the same way of making games, the same way of thinking about game design, then you wouldn't have that diversity. And I think that's a great thing about you out there watching, making your first game. We want you in the industry. We want new people to be coming in, making new exciting games that I could never have thought of, that I wouldn't have made a game like that. I wouldn't be able to consider how a game would work. Think of a game that you've played that you think, how did they ever think of that? Well, they did in part because they're different to you. And just as you can't imagine making the game you played that was designed by someone else, the game you design, other people couldn't even imagine how they would make it. So don't feel like you have to follow those other rules. Forge your own path in the games that you make. And lastly, be clear about why you're making this game. Why are you designing games in the first place? There are many different styles of game designers, but there are all different purposes. For example, at the moment, I'm a full-time game designer. I make my living from game design, from licensing my designs to companies, and they pay me royalties. And so my focus of the type of games I make and the process I use, that's suited to me. That's suited to that purpose of why I make games. Now, I didn't start that way. I started making games just kind of because I wanted to. I was sort of interested by the process. I didn't have to make any money from them, but money would just have been a bonus. And even forget about making money. Some people don't really worry about even getting a game published. For them, it's about the puzzle of making a game that works, regardless of whether it appears on a shelf or not. Each of these different purposes for making a game is going to necessitate a different process, a different set of guidelines for trying to make those games. So try to work out why do you want to make games? Do you want to make games so that they're published by another player and they can be bought and found on store shelves? Do you want to make it just to kind of create and to make something interesting, regardless of whether it makes money or not? Do you want to try and make some money? You don't necessarily have to know the answers to all these questions at the start, but maybe have a bit of a think about it. When you're looking at the different advice out there available, maybe try and gravitate to people whose purpose, whose why in making games is closer to yours. That way you'll get some advice that maybe is more useful. And the last idea, maybe one of the most important in my mind, is that finishing something is the most important step in game design, and especially in starting in game design. Beyond the first problem of actually getting a game onto the table, the next most common problem I see is that designers get stuck on a game, iterating, changing, never getting to the point of finishing it. And the thing is, really, when you start off in game design, when you make your first game, I see it as kind of a learning process. You have to go through the whole process from start to finish, from idea to first prototype, second prototype, etc., to the final game. You're not going to be able to learn the whole process if you don't go through it. And that includes finishing. And as you get to those last stages, there are many different types of skills that you need. You need that skill of editing, of being able to take something that's already there and making fine adjustments to make it just that little bit better, or potentially improving, the graphic design or the rules so that other players can actually play it without you, which is a very important part of the game. If you wanted to pitch to publishers, you better hope that the rules are good, because otherwise they won't know how to play the game either. And if you are always just iterating on a game and never trying to actually finish it, you're never going to learn those skills, and you need those skills in order to become a game designer, or to be getting used to making lots of different games if that's what you're trying to do. The other reason why finishing a game is important is that in some ways it's only really at the end of the whole process of making a game do you kind of understand what the game really is. Sometimes in the early stages you're sort of, you're wandering around a dark forest trying to figure out, what is this game? What is this idea that I'm working on? It's only when you get later on in the process that actually it can kind of crystallize. what you might have thought was like a solo adventure style role-playing game turns out to be this sort of quick puzzle type game. You wouldn't have known that until you got later on in the process necessarily. And so making sure getting to that point of finishing can give you new insight into your game and how you might perceive it going forward. I should put a small asterisk on this point. I use the word finishing, not publishing. I think it's important to focus on something that you can control in this process, and finishing a game to the point where you're happy with it, or you're happy to stop working on it, is definitely within your control. Getting a game published is not necessarily within your control. I'll talk about that in other videos, but usually for me that involves submitting a game that I finished to a publisher, asking what they think about it, and if they like it, then they might go on and publish it. But I don't necessarily control that. And sometimes you might get to the end of the game and you finish it, and you might not even like it. But that's okay, because you've learned from the whole process of completing it. You've learned from doing those finishing steps, and you'll be able to put that into your next game that you might like a bit better. It's fine to shelve the game once it's finished and never look at it again, or never pitch it to anybody. That's fine as well. That's been a useful learning process. So those are 3 pieces of advice I'd have to you if this is the year where you're going to try and finally make that game you've been thinking about for a really long time. As I said, this is just some advice. Take what works for you and discard the rest. I wish you all the best in that, and come back in the future. I hope to release more videos about game design, about learning game design, and about my own journey over the last decade or so in game design and what that's like. But thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again. Bye.